that you'll see in there, and we're just going to walk through them real quick. These are the questions you were to look at out of the very first chapter of the Gospel of Mark, and then we're going to take a brief moment, look at chapter 4, and tonight's focal point is really on the issue of identity. And the point of these questions, they all lead and they're all directing, and all the different activities that you're witnessing to and the voices you're hearing from are all pointing in the first part of Mark to drive at that question, who is this Jesus? Right up front, he's telling you this is the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and then he's just driving at really behind that. Here are the evidence after evidence after evidence after evidence that this one that I am talking about, this Jesus of Nazareth, is none other than God in the flesh. And so it's all driving at that reality. And you see that, in the beginning of Mark there, in Mark chapter 1, verse 2 and 3, we have from the prophets, and we have this declaration that this one declared that would come in the word from the prophets from 700 years before the coming of Christ. This one that would come is who? The Messiah, the Lord, right? The one who would be Lord, the one who would be sovereign. So the one who is God and King will come, Messiah, the one true King. John the Baptist in Mark chapter 1 and verse 7 said this one is going to come is what? Come on, if you did your homework, let's go, folks. All right. Okay, we're not trying to belabor. Let's go. Mightier than I, okay? This one that's coming is much more powerful than I am. In fact, John's baptizing with water. This one that will come will baptize with the Spirit of God, all right? We talked about the Spirit this morning. Okay, you have at the baptism, you have God himself thundering from heaven. This is one I am well pleased, all right? So all drawing our attention to Christ and this Son of God. And then we go to these various miracles, these different events, the situations in which we find, beginning in Mark 1:16, Jesus calls people to follow him, and what do? They follow. Why? Because he's Lord, remember? He has all authority. This one who's Lord calls you to follow. If you recognize who he really is, what are you going to do? You follow, all right? If you don't think he has authority, you won't. But when you recognize this one has all authority, then he says follow, you follow. All right? We find in Mark 1, verse 21 and 22, he teaches, in fact, and we don't get the full import of this. Jesus grew up in an obscure village in Nazareth. No good thing, as far as the Jew was concerned, came out of Nazareth. And here this untrained Jewish young man, and he would have been considered a very young man, who's not even right around 30 years of age, not even 30 probably when it just depends on your timing, all right? So right around 30 years of age. But so he's going into the temple and he starts teaching. Now, he didn't go to any of the Pharisaical schools. He's not recognized by any of them. And who is this young man? And he's teaching differently than anybody else. In fact, everybody's comment about his teaching is he's teaching as one with authority. All right, he's not making suggestions. He's saying this is what God says. And he is God himself. And everybody's like, where'd this guy come from? He's teaching like no other teacher we've ever heard. He rebukes the evil spirits, Mark chapter 1, verse 23 and 25. In fact, in Mark chapter 1, verse 23, and it's be an important term to pick up in verse 25, and as we get a little into our lesson, or into chapter 4 later. But when he's in the synagogues, the unclean spirits is interesting because, everybody's really asking this question, who is this? He's doing these signs, he's healing people, all this stuff going on, he's teaching with authority. Well, who is this guy? And here's the unclean spirits, right? What do you have to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? If you come to destroy us, we know who you are. I know who you are, the Holy One of God. And what does Jesus do? Rebukes. And what does the unclean spirit do? He leaves, all right? He's silent. He has all authority. We see that again and again in Mark chapter 1, verse 29 through 34. He comes to Simon and Andrew's home, and Simon's mother-in-law is ill, and he raises her. We go on in chapter down in later 40 to 45, and we find all people coming to him, and he's healing. In fact, in verse 32, 33, the whole city is gathering, and he's healing even the most serious ill. You come into chapter 2, and we find him forgiving sin. So again, I guess I could have, sorry. I didn't thumb through those, right? But you find all of these just driving behind this declaration, this gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and then here Mark is just coming behind that and telling us, moving from event to event to event, saying here is all the proof. This is what Jesus declared himself to be, who he declared himself to be. Here's the fulfillment of prophecy. Here's coming right out of the Old Testament prophecy to what he's doing. And here's just the continuing setting forth. Jesus, don't let anybody ever cop and tell you the story that Jesus never presented himself to be God. From the very get-go, he presented himself to be God. And in fact, that's why he went to a cross, because the Jews got exactly what he was saying. I am your Messiah. They said, no, you're not. You're not going to rule over us. And he declared it unequivocally throughout his life and ministry. And in fact, tonight, the point we're going to get in and drive at is going to deal with the whole issue of Christ's identity. The responses were varied early in ministry. People were astonished. They're amazed. Crowds are flocking. As I said, if you could just begin to paint the picture of what was happening, the anticipation, the excitement. The healer, he's a healer. They got that, all right? He comes to town and he starts healing people. Everybody's coming. I tried to illustrate this, and again, just paint that picture. If I could go down to Morton Plan, any one of the hospitals, walk through the floor and say, be healed, be healed, be healed. I'll do that on Saturday. What do you think church would look like on Sunday? There would not be a phone that would not have rang. There would not be somebody saying to their relative that's sick, you need to go. Everybody on that floor was healed. Go. All right, and so Jesus can hardly move. People are just crowding in, packing around. They want a chance to be healed. They want to see something. And so that just all of this is happening, and it's all percolating all around, and people are saying, well, maybe this is the Messiah, and others are, no, it couldn't be. And he's from Nazareth, and that can't be the Messiah. And all this is happening in Jerusalem, and all of this is just percolating throughout wherever Jesus is going. In fact, he has all the crowds build up, and what does Jesus do? He says, look, he goes out in solitary places. Peter and the disciples come and say, everybody's looking for you. No kidding. What does Jesus say? Hey, I didn't come to draw a mega church. Sorry. Jesus said, I didn't come for that. He said, this isn't a sideshow. He said, I'm going to other towns. Why? I came to preach the gospel. That's why I came. And he goes on to proclaim the gospel and moves through Galilee, and he's doing all of this, and everything is spread, and people are coming from everywhere. And it's all centering around, who is this one who has come? And the disciples themselves, they're following. Their faith is growing. They've believed he is the Messiah, but they're still, they're wrestling with it, and they're you can see at moments that they got great confident faith, at other moments not so much, and they're a lot like us, okay? In fact, there's a great book, MacArthur wrote it, called 12 Ordinary Men. You want a good read? I should give one of those away. I will, all right? It's a great read. It walks through their lives and just reminds us that the apostles were ordinary men who God used in extraordinary ways. And when you begin to get hopeless at times about the state of your nation and all that other stuff, just remember, God took 12 guys to change the world. Same God on the throne. All right? So he changed, just radical transformation in their lives. But we watch them wrestle with all of it. In fact, we come to an event where we're going to look at that in Mark chapter 4. So Mark chapter 4, if you look with me, 35 through 41. On that day, when the evening had come, he said to them, let us go across to the other side. And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. And the other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking over the boat, so the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion, and they woke him and said, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said to them, Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, Who then is this that even the winds and the sea obey him? And as we look at this text, one of the things that you ask, first question there is, there's other boats there. That's one of those, what's the point of that? Well, it's not a trivial detail. They're going to go to the other side, and they get in the boat to leave, and there are other boats around. Why is that? Why did we need to know that? Because those boats aren't mentioned again at all. Only the boat that Jesus is in, and then the storm comes, and we got panicked disciples. But you know, when they went to set sail, there's other boats setting sail too, right? So what does it tell you about the day they were setting sail on? There wasn't a threat of a storm. These were men that were on the boat with Jesus, by the way, were not unexperienced in the waters. They were fishermen, 4 of them by trade. They knew the waters, they knew them well. They knew the conditionality of a day to sail and the day not to. And in fact, there are other boats around, and that's the very point. It's part of the point of the text. These other boats are there. Everybody's setting sail. There's not a chance of a storm today. But then a storm arises, right? In fact, the emphasis of the text is on kind of the unexpected and sudden nature and the violent nature of the storm. And so this storm comes, and we then find as the storm arises, they're fighting the storm. Where's Jesus? He's asleep. Boat's being battered. In fact, it begins to fill. And these experienced sailors, fishermen, now are in a full-blown what? Panic. We're going to die. That was their conclusion, wasn't it? In fact, so much so, they run and wake up Jesus and basically accuse him of what? Not caring. You know, when the difficulties come, this is one of the places we all in our flesh tend to go. Don't you care? And they come in the midst of their difficulty and they wake Jesus up, and don't you care that we're perishing? And then we find the remarkable event about Jesus calming the storm. In fact, the language is remarkable as well. What does it say Jesus does? He rebukes the storm. Now that's a strange term. Bad storm, go away. I mean, he rebuked it. Now you're kind of going, maybe you don't. Maybe you didn't ever think about that. You just think, Jesus has control over nature. Yeah, we get that. Well, this storm comes up suddenly. Nothing looked like there was any storm out there, and it comes up suddenly, and Jesus gets up to rebuke the storm. Well, again, if you go back and you've been reading Mark, you find that word rebuke actually comes a couple other times, and it comes in Jesus dealing with demons. And he rebukes demons. And he's told the disciples, in fact, when he gathered the disciples to him, he told them earlier, Mark, he was commissioning them, would take the gospel, and along with it, they would cast out demons. And they're going to take the gospel beyond Israel. In fact, that's what they're doing right now, right? They're taking the gospel outside of Israel. They're going to take this gospel message to Gentiles. And so we're about to go to the other side, and all of a sudden this storm comes, and Jesus rebukes it. What was the source of the storm? Demonic opposition. Do you think the devil wants the gospel to go places? Do you think when you get ready to share the gospel, folks, here's news for you. Now, this may not be the best news, all right? We're making a concerted effort as a church to be evangelistic in our community. Can I just give you a little tip? Expect great opposition. Expect it. Expect there to be opposition. It'll rise its ugly head, and all kinds of things are going to happen to try and get you to be silent when you should not be silent. And the disciples cower in fear, right? Jesus rebukes it, but he didn't just rebuke the storm, he rebuked the disciples. Not for waking him up, but for being afraid. There's always going to be opposition. But didn't I give you authority over that opposition? Didn't he? And didn't he tell them that the gospel is going to go forward and you yourselves are actually going to cast out demons? All right, now that was a miraculous gift. Don't go around trying to cast out demons. That's not what I'm telling you to do. But here they're afraid, and the gospel's going forward, and their response demonstrates a lack of faith, a lack of confidence in what God's told us to do. Listen, God has told us the gospel is the power of God unto salvation, right? Not our gimmickry, not some let's make the gospel more palatable to people, let's play a little more entertainment games, maybe we can draw a better crowd. God has said, put your confidence in my gospel and go proclaim it. And know this, when you do it, there's going to be all kinds of opposition out there. And the devil's going to try and get you to stop and be afraid. Don't be afraid. Do we have such little faith? The gospel is God's power to salvation. And when you have the courage to begin to proclaim it, opposition will come. And then our response to opposition is a revelation of what? Our faith. How much do we really believe and trust Christ? And so we're driving at this great reality of our taking forward the gospel, and then also driving at this great reality of the identity of Christ. So guys, if you'd show the chapter number 2 there, Kevin.
Not so long ago, I was invited out to lunch, and as I'd arrived a bit early, I waited on the stairs just off the main dining room. Standing opposite me was another man. I vaguely recognised him, but thought nothing of it. So as English people do, we gave each other a sheepish nod and stood there awkwardly for 5 minutes in total silence. This lasted from 12:55 until 1 o'clock. Anyway, at 1 o'clock, a man came from around the corner, looked up at the man beside me and exclaimed, "Ah, William, there you are, we're in the private dining room." Turns out, it was Prince William. I'd been with him for 5 whole minutes and we had nothing better to do than talk to each other, and I hadn't said a single word. And now, I'd lost the opportunity. It could have been so different. I'm not saying that those 5 minutes would have changed my life, and I don't suppose we'd have become lifelong friends or anything like that. But I know the conversation would have been memorable. Sadly, all I saw was a handsome, well-dressed 25-year-old with thinning blonde hair. What I didn't see was my future king. Now, in William's case, missing his identity doesn't really matter. I just missed out on a once-in-a-lifetime conversation, and arguably, so did he. But that's about it. Sometimes, though, getting someone's identity right really does matter. Because if we don't get Jesus' identity right, we'll relate to him in totally the wrong way, or even ignore him completely. And missing this king's identity would be disastrous. That's why Mark gives us the historical evidence we need so that we can recognize Jesus for who he is. Evidence that comes from the first-hand eyewitness accounts of people who spent years by Jesus' side. We're going to focus on 5 ways that Mark reveals Jesus' identity. Mark wants us to understand by showing Jesus' power and authority that Jesus really does have the right to be in charge, that he really is God's only chosen king. Our first block of evidence is about Jesus' power and authority to teach. Mark gives an example of this in chapter 1, verses 21 to 22.
They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus went into the synagogue and began to teach. The people were amazed at his teaching, because he taught them as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. You see, what set Jesus apart from the other teachers was the way that he taught. The teachers of the law didn't come up with their own material. They relied on the great teachers of the past and just gave their opinions on what others had said. But Jesus was very different. He didn't need to stand on anyone else's authority. He claimed authority of his own. And you can see the effect that this had on people. We read that they were amazed at his words and asked each other, "What is this? A new teaching, and with authority." This young man, with hardly any education to speak of, was suddenly providing brilliant answers to questions that baffled even the wisest of teachers. So he could teach, but was Jesus able to live out what he taught? I have to say that this was the first thing that I found so compelling about Jesus. At 16, I started to keep a journal. I decided that I was such a great guy that I owed it to the world to preserve the details of my life. What I found as I looked at what I'd written was my own selfishness. There was such a contradiction between the way I presented myself in my journal and the way I actually lived in reality. But Jesus was no hypocrite. For example, he taught, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Later, as he was being killed, he prayed for his executioners, "Father, forgive them. They do not know what they're doing." Now that is practicing what you preach. But Jesus wasn't just a teacher. Our second block of evidence shows that Jesus has power and authority over sickness. One example of this comes in Mark chapter 1, verses 29 to 31. As soon as they left the synagogue, they went with James and John to the home of Simon and Andrew. Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they told Jesus about her. So he went to her, took her hand, and helped her up. The fever left her, and she began to wait on them. Here we see Jesus demonstrating absolute authority over sickness. Just a touch of his hand, and the fever is cured. And this is not an isolated incident either. 3 verses later, in verse 34, we read that Jesus cured whole crowds of sick people. Soon after that, a man with leprosy comes to him. It was a disease so terrible that no one even wanted to go near those who were suffering with it. Filled with compassion, Jesus reaches out his hand and touches the man, and his touch instantly cures him. Mark also tells us that Jesus cured people of spiritual suffering as well as physical suffering, releasing people from demonic oppression. By verse 12 of chapter 2, everyone is amazed, saying, "We've never seen anything like this." As you might expect, someone with that kind of power does not go unnoticed elsewhere. For example, Josephus, a historian of Jesus' time, who was not a Christian, called Jesus a doer of wonderful deeds. Although people disagreed about where it came from, no one, not even Jesus' enemies, doubted Jesus' power. Then thirdly, and perhaps even more amazingly, we see that Jesus has power and authority over nature. Jesus and his followers are in a boat on the Lake of Galilee, and this is what happens in chapter 4, verses 37 to 39. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat, so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. Now, the Greek word translated furious squall actually means whirlwind. As the waves break over the boat, nearly swamping it, Jesus' followers, some of whom are hardened fishermen, are convinced they're about to die. In their terror, they wake Jesus. But Jesus simply gets up, says a few words, and immediately everything is perfectly calm. The disciples then ask each other a question we may be asking ourselves. Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. However, in the next chapter, the disciples witness something even more astonishing. They witness Jesus' power and authority over death. That's our fourth block of evidence about Jesus' identity, and it's in Mark chapter 5. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake,
A large crowd gathered round him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue rulers named Jairus came there. Seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." Here we have a religious leader, a synagogue ruler named Jairus, in agony because he is powerless to help his young daughter who is dying. Imagine the desperation and powerlessness you would feel if your own child was dying. That's the emotional intensity here. Death wasn't an issue for me until I was 16, but then my godfather was killed suddenly when he lost his footing on a cliff path. And then I discovered for myself how painful death is, not least because it severs relationships with people we dearly love. And loving relationships are so hard to come by. I remember coming across a bereavement card that said, "Those whom we have loved never really go away." But that's a lie. That's the whole problem. They do go away, and we miss them terribly. Some men came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue ruler. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Ignoring what they said, Jesus told the synagogue ruler, "Don't be afraid, just believe." Now, what kind of a man is able to say to a grieving father, "Don't worry, just put your trust in me"? It's either the voice of a man who is spectacularly misguided, or the voice of one who is supremely confident of his own power. You've got to be very sure of yourself to say that to a man who has just lost his daughter. He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue ruler, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha kum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and walked around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. Well, you would be, wouldn't you? Jesus tells them the girl isn't dead, she's just sleeping. Then he takes the hand of the corpse, says, "Get up," and the father is reunited with the daughter he thought was lost to him forever. The message is clear. It's as easy for Jesus to raise someone from the dead as it is for us to rouse someone from sleep. Now, if this is a man who has power and authority over death, surely it would be madness to ignore him, to say, "I'm just not interested in this," or "this is boring," or "well, that's fine for you to believe." One day, you and I are going to die. After the evidence we've just seen, the question we must ask ourselves is this: can I trust Jesus with my own death? But I have to say, "Quiet, be still," and "get up" are not the most outrageous things Jesus says in Mark. For that, we have to go to our final block of evidence in chapter 2, verses 1 to 5. A few days later, when Jesus again entered Capernaum, the people heard that he had come home. So many gathered that there was no room left, not even outside the door, and he preached the word to them. Some men came, bringing to him a paralytic carried by 4 of them. Since they could not get into Jesus because of the crowd, they made an opening in the roof above Jesus, and after digging through it, lowered the mat the paralyzed man was lying on. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Now those words really are extraordinary. Here's a man who presumably wants to be cured of his paralysis, and Jesus wants to cure him of his sin. Why would Jesus think sin was a more pressing issue than the man's paralysis? To understand that, we need to see what the Bible means by the word sin. A while back, a national newspaper had an article on the 7 deadly sins, and the writer said this: "In this day and age, sin has lost its sting. A bit of sinning is much more likely to be seen as a spot of grown-up naughtiness, the kind of thing that sends a delicious shock through the system." That's what many people think of sin these days. It's not very serious. It's a bit of fun on the side. But the Bible says that there's nothing nice about sin. Jesus always taught that sin is man's biggest problem. It's not paralysis, not global warming, not terrorism or ecological disaster or poverty, not lack of education or spiritual enlightenment, but sin.
Sin isn't just doing naughty things. It's not just lust or laziness or whatever. According to the Bible, sin is ignoring our Creator in the world He has made. As we know, ignoring other human beings is damaging enough, to us and to them, and living without reference to the one who made us and gives us each breath is even more damaging. Because when I insist on my independence from the one who made me and sustains my life, it will lead to death. Not just here, but eternal death, described in the Bible as hell.
So that's why Jesus homes in on the problem of this man's sin. And the claim that Jesus makes here is that he has the power and authority to forgive our sin. You can see how staggering this is if you look at the way the religious leaders react.
Now some teachers of the law were sitting there thinking to themselves, why does this fellow talk like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone?
Now they don't mind the paralytic being called a sinner. They know everyone's a sinner. Their problem is with Jesus claiming to be able to forgive sin. If sin is ignoring God in the world he has made, then only God has the authority to forgive it. After all, if we do a person wrong, then only the wronged person has the right to forgive us. And in this case, the wronged party is God himself. The question is, does Jesus really have the authority to forgive sin? Does he really have the right to identify himself with Almighty God? Or is Jesus blaspheming, as the religious leaders are quietly thinking to themselves? To answer that question, Jesus does something amazing.
Immediately, Jesus knew in his spirit that this was what they were thinking in their hearts. And he said to them, why are you thinking these things? Which is easier, to say to the paralytic, your sins are forgiven, or to say, get up, take your mat and walk? But that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, he said to the paralytic, I tell you, get up, take your mat, and go home. He got up, took his mat, and walked out in full view of them all. This amazed everyone, and they praised God, saying, we have never seen anything like this.
As if to illustrate his claim to have God's authority and power, Jesus immediately cures the man's paralysis with a few words. But the healing is not an end in itself. He doesn't do it with a flourish as if performing magic tricks at a circus. No, he cures this man and countless others in order to reveal to us his true identity. He is quite obviously behaving with God's authority and God's power, and he expects us to draw the obvious conclusion. Mark shows us time and again that Jesus not only claims to have the authority of God, he also displays the power of God as he teaches, heals the sick, calms the storm, raises the dead, and forgives sin. He acts in God's world with God's authority. Of course, if Jesus is actually God's Son, then it really matters. It gets very personal. Do I recognize who he is?
Will I listen to him as my teacher? Can I acknowledge that he has complete control over the circumstances of my life, over sickness, over nature, and even over my own death?
Can I see that he is the only one with the power and authority to forgive my sin or to leave it unforgiven? Will I recognize him now while I have the chance, or will I recognize him later when it's too late?
All right. So where did you pick up on the definition of sin there? Did you catch it? How do you define sin? Okay, to ignore God, right? To live, I mean, the fool says in his heart there is no God, all right? To live like you're not in God's world, to live like we're not under God's authority is at the essence of our sin, because we're created to glorify God, and you cannot do that by ignoring God, right? And that's pretty, I mean, it's a little bit, really, the theological, give you the quick theological definition of sin that Dr. McCune always gave was basically anything, anywhere that is unlike God is sin. Anywhere, anything, anywhere, at any time that is unlike God is sin, right? So anything in my life, any attitude, any action, any response, every way that is unlike God is sinful. And that brings me then in that under that judgment. So that's why he really sets and what he's helping us to understand is you got to remember Mark as a writer of the gospel, it starts his gospel with a very clear declaration. I'm writing to you the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Now I'm going to walk through. Here are all the evidences that this is God's own Son. And he's walking through just right one thing after another and just bringing it and piling it on top, that this is God's very Son who has come. And so, as he mentions and really powerfully puts forward, getting the identity right is absolutely essential, or we miss everything. We miss everything. So all the people want to say, well, Jesus was a good teacher. Yeah, but he was so much more, right? So much more. And I love the connection. If you miss the connection at the end, the connection point, you know, if Jesus has authority, I mean, he is the greatest teacher. That means I need his word. I need to hear from him. He has authority over all sickness. He has authority over all nature. He has authority over death, and he can forgive. So every circumstance in life that you face, Jesus Christ has authority. Everything you'll ever face, he has the authority over. And throughout the Gospel of Mark, and really throughout Jesus' earthly ministry, he was demonstrating, I have authority over all of these things. Which then is to say what? You can trust me with your very life. Every circumstance, even your death, you can trust me with all of it. I have authority over it all. Isn't that amazing good news? Isn't it an amazing comfort and hope as you face living in a fallen world, as you face dealing with your own sinfulness, that you serve the God who has authority over everything. And he calls on us to trust and obey, right? No other way. Trust and obey. And so it's a powerful presentation of the gospel, and a powerful, we're giving you some great tools for you to communicate the gospel. And I pray that God will encourage your heart through it and grow your own confidence, because as you go out and share the gospel, remember, expect opposition. The devil will not be happy with you being a witness. Your flesh will want other people's approval more than their salvation. Just will, okay? It's going to want other people's acceptance more than their salvation. And they need to be saved. And God can open their heart, show them their sin, and save them. His gospel is his power into salvation. And so, and I know we all have people in our life you share the gospel with, and you think they're so hard, maybe there's just no hope for them. Listen, God's power you can never overstate. We can only underbelieve, right? So you trust the Lord. As God opens up doors to talk with him, you keep sharing the gospel with them and praying God to open their eyes and their heart. And when he does, their life will be radically transformed forever. Let's pray.